Hello everyone, today we talk about the Black Death, right? Also wishing that what we're going through in last couple of years is finally over, factually having already gone endemic in spite of the absolute levels of saying that, but evidently, going towards that direction. So it's not to make it sound, reminding. Of course, there is a good reminder, right? Things. First of all, that we were lucky because, of course, if you consider what happened in 1348, actually slightly before, as we will see when the plague arrived. Yes, we are lucky. We are lucky not just because we are, of course, more advanced, sanitarily speaking, in medicine, in quality of life in general, to be more resistant, but just lucky because things could go bad, severely bad, in ways that we have not been touched by, even after this, unpleasant time. And that can help us understand, however, mostly in the consequences of the plague in itself. Lots of things that happened. In fact, as you know, in the broader crisis of the late Middle Ages, we talked about it very often. And yet it's important to insist on it, to insist especially on the cause effect connections, and not much because of the plague in itself, that, as you know, is debated. Was the plague just a cause or a consequence of the crisis? Because probably it's both at the same time. I believe that the system was exhausted in many ways, had weakened itself, and also favoring the spread of these illnesses in the first place, considering also the hygienic conditions, the properly the immunity, let's say the lower immunitary defenses of a large part of the population that had lowered over time, given certain particular lifestyles and how the system had come to produce, to work like. Well, today we will not really talk about this per se, but surely it's important to stress that that's perhaps the most correct way of seeing the thing, like as a cause and a consequence at the same time. And therefore not thinking also that progress is just linear up until there is just some external factor that brings it down, right? Human communities are always messed up as they can be, right? Even when they grow and even when they produce, obtain, achieve. This is not by itself, just materially speaking, the indicator of of well-being per se, right? Which doesn't mean that anything that so far we have experimented is actually, better. Just to make the point of some people who believe that, I don't know. Also, if you're poor, things are fine, but not really. The point is that, still, the more complex you make a community, and the more things can go wrong. Whereas it's simply physical realization, mathematical. It's about the stability of the system, and so it's important at that point to mostly irregimentate some forms of political and social control, or at least of mediation, of regulation that can help to balance all the various dynamics. In any case, at the time, as you understand, this was also a very primitive world where such huge amount of wealth and of growth and uncontrolled kind of political fragmentation and lack of super, let's say, of super structural capacity of control rendered the system very, very exposed to these factors. And of course, in part, it was also able to absorb the shock in a way, but it brought at that point to a much greater increase in such control, as we'll see now, and for good, because again, the medieval civilization was resized by this phenomenon. If anything, demographically, especially. Economically, we're talking just about the other day, in part, right? It was also rather a rearrangement right, a reorganization in some sort, but in fact it kept growing eventually. It kept growing on importantly stable basis, gave origin to the Renaissance, to the modern state, and so on. Now, indeed, however, the plague itself, even if it were just a consequence of the, say, the instability and the problems of the system, its exhaustion, right, its internal destabilization or ravaging, or at least properly consumption of energies and so on, arrived as an external factor, something that, you know, determined the collapse of the European system at many levels. And if it hadn't happened, of course, you know, it doesn't make sense to say, you know, what if it hadn't happened, because considering how interconnected the world was and how certain bacilli are fundamentally spreading anyway, it's something doesn't make sense. If it hadn't happened in 1347, 48, it would have happened at some other point. Would have found other ways. It would have changed history probably, because in those years other things would have happened in different ways. So everything would have changed the system. But still, this had probably to happen in a way or another. And and if it hadn't been because of the plague, it would have been because of some other, you know, bacillus properly. As we'll see, the plague is a generic term. In any case, well, you know how it happened. During 1346, a serious plague epidemic, seemingly coming from China, unsurprisingly, I would say, where it was raging from more than 1 decade, right? And just think how, you know, the communications and the contacts, connection today took just, you know, much less. Of course, we can't compare the two type of pandemic, let's say, but certain basins of population can remain relatively isolated for the spread to be less, less fast, as you can imagine medieval communications. Anyhow, in China had been a big deal. It had broke out in Asia, probably in Central Asia, by the way. In 1347, it was transported in Europe, right? We don't know whether it had passed from China. I mean, it doesn't even make sense, right? There were probably multiple people that came, multiple, even the same animals and so on, and that might have come just straight from Central Asia, or maybe were coming back from China. In any case, perhaps also likely, we don't know, from Genoese ships that were essentially crossing from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, loaded in the grain of Crimea. It spread, in fact, in the Mediterranean, starting from the port of Messina. It was the gate for the east, in Sicily, and from there to other Tyrrhenian localities. So much that in the first year it spread, in fact, mostly along the western Mediterranean, the coasts, and so on, to eventually spread everywhere, as you can imagine. The limits just being the scarcity of the rarefaction of population in northeastern Europe, but it struck importantly, in fact, also in Scandinavia and Russia, right? So it's also relative. Then it's important to stress the uncertain character, if not, maybe even not the particularly alarming one, of the first phases of the pestilence, because it arrived, as we've seen, in Italy and in the western part of the Mediterranean in autumn 1347. And at that point it stopped. It froze during winter, because between December and March, the proliferation of the agents of contagion, the fleas, did not, are not favorable, right? So it reappeared again to rage for long and cruelly, starting from spring. And in March, from March to May, the increase of the spread of the contagion from the coasts towards the hinterland was was hallucinating, right? The unfortunate cities that hadn't been still touched by it were terrorized at its progress, looking at, checking, trying to check it. They were anxious to find news. They spied the worried from within their own city walls the appearance of the signs of the illness, and the plague raged for 3 long years in the continent. But at the end of 13, say from the end of the 1347 to the summer 1350, sometimes even beyond, right? Because there were some other branches, for example. Yeah, it seems even the area of the steppes was not particularly struck. It came mostly from this western to eastern, even in Europe, right? So, but anyhow, there were naturally, the spread was heterogeneous because of all the different communities and connections and so on. So plague, pestilence, Black Death are vague, imprecise terms, because between the pulmonary, septicemic, and glandular, or bubonic as it's called, plague, there is an important difference, right? So they are very different, completely different afflictions, which doesn't mean that they cannot present themselves all together, as in fact it happened in the epidemics of 1347-1350. The bubonic plague is inoculated through the bacillus of the flea that carries it. The pulmonary one is transmitted from man to man, and our ancestors called often plague also other things, right? For example, the epidemics of asymptomatic typhus, with which the still the scary bacillus of the Pasteurella pestis, discovered by Yersin in 1894, has nothing to do with. And so witnesses of great epidemics in the past had been handed down by famous writers. There is the Athenian plague of 429 BC, described by Thucydides, the one of Rome of 66 AD, which Tacitus talked about, Justinian's plague of 542, about which Procopius of Caesarea wrote, and kind of some of the descriptions were known very well in medieval times. Some were horrifying. If you read Lucretius' De Rerum Natura, for example, it's the part of the plague is terrifying. Very, very graphic. In any case, it had been since the 6th century. So we're talking really about 700 years or even more that in Europe such a pandemic had never been experienced anymore. Yes, there had been local epidemics of various illnesses that had been experimented by the European population during the centuries, especially 11 to 13, when that were in fact the moment of greater activity, of expansion, of contact with Europe within its own boundaries and outside of it. So such epidemics had systematized, let's say, in their frequency in a way. They were connected also importantly to the economical cycles in case of famines, etc. So that's always this idea that their presence was not just random, right? So they were always caused by some preconditions, by a sort of favorite list by them. But demographically speaking, the outcome of such epidemics were fundamentally mild. In the mid-14th century, instead, the violence of the epidemics and perhaps its concentration on a weakened population that had spent, had already experienced important famines for long years, famously enough, the one of 1317 was very strong. I made a video about that. Sometimes it was, this population was, as we've seen, unmasked in the urban centers that had, overly enlarged. It was all salaried workers that had come from the countryside with nothing. And among them, they lived in the suburbs, packed in their hygiene, as you understand, was very, very, very poor. Their diet was poor in fat and proteins. But anyway, so they had less immunity defenses and so on. So the spread of the plague at this point caused a true continental calamity. And because the centers of connections were the cities as well, so it was more likely to pass from the plague to pass from there than any other place, and that's where the majority of people were, say, not the majority of people in absolute terms, but where all these masses of people were concentrated in space. Of course, the countryside was the most populated area, as in any pre-industrial society in absolute terms, but even in there, right, spread also because some countries were very populated at that point as well. And the sources describe the quick, the courses of the illness, right? There was the appearance of a principal symptom, a boil in the armpit or groins areas, the passage from the bubonic to the secondary pulmonary form, marked by the blood expectoration. So according to recent studies, Europe came out of the epidemics seriously debilitated. Right, in certain areas, as England, it seems that even up to 1/4 of the population died during the plague. In other places, such as, for example, certain areas of France, of Germany, of Italy, the death rate of the population reached 35%. And in some cases, they even surpassed this limit. However, there were some areas that were mysteriously spared from this, such as, for example, Milan, which you would expect as one of the most important trade centers to be immediately struck. Instead, plague is not reported. I never checked the thing myself. I think, the sources may be, if it didn't happen, of course it spread even in there, it's just it seems that it didn't break out, and we don't know why. Other areas, such as Poland at large, seem to have been spared. These things probably, if you realize the increase, let's say properly the loss in population, might have explained some sort of political phenomena. Now that I think about it, Milan and Poland in the second half of the 14th century even grew importantly as powers once again, and so over the others. But of course, this is in relative terms. They suffered as well of the whole economic contraction. It was a mess. We will be studying this thing, but in relative terms, just banally having more people at the time and somewhat having remained standing meant a lot. So this thing redrew also something in the political map of Europe. The epidemic disappeared, as we've seen, during 1351, and however, it continued to essentially roam the continent by, let's say, maintaining in it at an endemic state and reappearing, however, in ensuing waves during the 15th and the 16th century, up until the following pandemics of 1630. During the 30 Years' War, that was pretty heavy as well, and during the crisis, 17th century as well. Even in there, right, you understand there is always a connection, even with political reality. It's not just some strange factor happening by chance, only at least. And so, given this terrible wave, this terrible demographic loss, you understand that the the population remained depressed numerically. Right? Perhaps at the end of the 15th century only the level of European population started rising again. This is not due to the plague in itself, it's due to the political and social changes that it triggered, to the various generational cycles, production, but I mean, these things we will see at some point. So in this period, it's been calculated that the population of the European continent reached only 60% of the one of 2 centuries before, at the end of the 13th century. And it would have been necessary to wait up to the 18th for the, let's say, gaps caused by this 14th century collapse could be filled again, quantitatively. And just to give an example, given that it's always difficult to be precise about demography for these times, etc., but some areas are better studied, and it seems that, for example, the English population in 1348 counted something like 3,750,000 inhabitants, right? Some say even up to 5 million. Anyhow, in 1430, the English population reached only 2,100,000 or 300,000, right? Which a decrease that, according to the most optimistic estimates, would be of 44%, right? Which is inferior, by the way, to the one that can be registered in certain areas of Italy, when it seems that the thing went down to 50%. Just think about that. What that means, right? Even just in the field of activities, etc. By the end of the 13th century, like 1/4 of Europeans were Italians, for example. At this point, the whole thing changed dramatically. The economy was redrawn. You know that this went all in parallel with financial disasters, with things that really changed properly the nature of states and how they had to be reorganized. And again, it's not just a plague, but the plague did a lot as a fact. In Florence, population of 1348 touched perhaps 100,000 inhabitants. Now, 1 century and a half later, the city didn't count more than 60,000 citizens. Now, this serious situation, as you understood, chronicized, right, with a loss literally 1/3 of European population, and this of course is not connected just to the plague. The epidemic hit such harshly, as we've seen hitting especially the cities, and among the least, among the poorest classes, let's say those that lived in more promiscuity and less hygiene. Also because the bad harvests had weakened the population during the famines that had occurred, right? So, furthermore, in the 14th, 15th century, you can see how, albeit the wars were not particularly bloody for those who fought in them. At least, this is debatable. It's a stereotype that they actually try to debunk, but it's fair to say, at least, that we have underestimated how bloody warfare was before that period as well. But they were also starting ruinous wars for the civilian populations, for reasons that now we can't properly just explain, because it's a big thing, and of course it's an approximation as a concept, but it's important to picture it as well, because the difference between the military and the civilians kind of increased, and together with that, with the greater exposure of civilians to military violence. These wars also were not much anymore. We were talking about it the other day. You can literally see a decrease in pitched battles after the 14th century crisis. it's very easy, right? Before you had tens of battles in decades. After that, you had just a bunch of them in decades. You can't really count that, right? It's not even armies. Armies were also, numerically speaking, usually smaller, right? Even if they costed more sometimes. Cavalry, after the Black Death, required importance, right? It went in parallel with this refeudalization of politics and society. It wasn't at all the rise of infantries, right? That happened in the first half of the 14th century, and in any case, I don't know I don't remember what I was saying. In any case, these wars were, even if they costed sometimes more because cavalry costed more, so you have sometimes an increase in absolute terms in cavalry, but still a shrinking because infantry kind of disappears. That you can measure that through the fact that properly the masses of commoners and peasants had been the ones who had been wiped out the most. And in fact, by 1348, the great infantry victories of commoners and peasants stopped. There had been literally 20 in the previous half century. This stopped with the year of the plague. This is extremely important because you can see properly the by scale how impacting the plague was in that sense. And again, not just the plague, but all the consequences that came from that. It's not just that those people, it's not that there was less infantry because all that infantry died in the plague, right? It's that those who had remained very often couldn't properly even afford to fight anymore, or wouldn't see it fit anymore. They needed somebody to depose arms, to put themselves under somebody's protection, rather than thinking to pick up arms and participating again, because the economical upheaval was enormous. It was a dramatic crisis under that point of view as well. So that favored the refeudalization of society. And these wars were, in this sense, witnessing a decrease in moral strength of the populace. It's as if civilians had become ever more passive, right? With the suffering raids, sacks, the devastation of the cultivated fields, the interruption of of some important commercial routes, especially in the continent. Some areas of Europe were, depopulated at the point the forests came back in many places. And so in general, also intercontinental trade, however, as we were saying the other day, via sea, increased. And normally this wasn't just an everyday guy doing that. There were very often powerful city-states that had the assets, could build the ships and so on. So something that was in a sense driving away that more scattered entrepreneurial orientation that some people had up, many people had actually been before the crisis. So all this was reflected by an hemorrhage, a continuous hemorrhage of wealth, right? A constant cause of famine that derived from fact, just populations had to escape, their harvest was destroyed and so on. Consequently, the epidemic would come back because these people would start starving to death, to be ever weaker. So the bacillus spread more easily, right? And so it was a vicious cycle. The demographic decrease was reflected, first of all, on the countryside, where it went, however, in parallel with a deep movement of redefinition of agricultural property and of the market of the products and the salaries. The most important phenomenon is the one we were saying before, this the population, right? The phenomenon of the abandoned villages, so much that every country in Europe had its term. The lost villages in England, the Wüstungen in Germany, the village déserté in France. And this is about settlements that were usually born in impervious areas, like in mountains, the margins of swamps, or scarcely fertile places where effectively the great deforestation, reclaiming, etc., of the previous centuries had stopped, right, because of the physical boundary presented by these obstacles, and that, of course, were the least profitable areas, the areas that required more resources to keep fertile, and so when struck by the crisis were abandoned because the local communities couldn't support themselves anymore. So the pressure of the 11th to 13th century demographic growth had brought, now it was recontracting, right, spatially speaking. So paradoxically, it was the best of the lands, the most productive ones, that had remained more depopulated because the people had concentrated there, so the plague had struck rather than them, in relative terms at least. So we're talking about the plains, or at least the lower hills, and therefore those places were less remunerative, were abandoned in favor of for repopulating these more advantageous areas. However, there was another problem, that the demographic crisis had determined the fall of the cereal prices, while given the diminution of the number of peasants, the cost of labor force had increased. So it's not difficult to understand how the peasantry lost dramatically, let's say, power on its own, because they were the ones who produced, and that, however, didn't have the wealth to, that were struck by the lack of exports, but they didn't have, in fact, enough money to hire in turn. So you understand that the elite would be greatly favored by this situation. In practice, this also advised a reconversion of some lands that were destined at some point to the cereal cultivations. This because it was more remunerative to plant some, say, some resources for industrial use, such as hemp, linen, or hops, rather than, or coloring plants, for example, such as madder or pastel or woad, than cereals, or even reducing these lands to pasture for the cattle. So this is a typical reconversion that would occur towards the end of the Middle Ages, with much less need properly to produce cereals, because great part of the people who had consumed them had been wiped out. Right, this is evident also in the cities themselves, and some landed seigneuries were living difficult times because the fall of the cereal prices and increase of working force, of course, cut their own revenues, that were threatened also by the devaluation of the currency that struck the rents that were cashed with like liquid, with direct with money, properly with coins. So thus, all over Europe, there was a market tendency from the side of the small landowners to sell their own property, which as a consequence caused a concentration of the land and of the land, properly of the assets, riches, in a more limited amount of hands, while the great landowners were turning to the ever more indirect management of their land's assets. Right, they granted them in a rent, for example, as it happened in Tuscany, famously enough, after the negotiation of a special contract that is essentially sharecropping, that contemplated the share, in fact, of the various crops harvests between an owner and the worker of this land. And it is possible that behind such attitude that was spread among the the wealthy, among the elites of the 14th and 15th century, you can read a process of deep and slow alienation, extraneation from the land of a ruling class that preferred, in fact, to inhabit in the great cities, or in at least in nearbys of the courts of the monarch, of the sovereigns, and to, in fact, enjoy the fruits of this rents rather than directly curing their own agricultural possessions. This is also because, as we've seen, actually international trade was not really, especially in Europe as such, was not really, didn't really decrease. There were great shifts of routes, there were redefinitions, but especially with the strengthening of the elites, the enrichment of the elites, the most luxury, expensive products were started, as we've seen, even in the agricultural production, it would be more convenient instead than cereals. And so these were goods that would be exported on a longer range, because mostly they were for the elites. And so the elites were not, they were, as always, they were the most international, because they were the ones who ruled over larger areas, and therefore the distances of the trade increased for them at the same time. So this brought to important cultural changes. But it's not happening everywhere. So much that there are some differences in Europe that are very important, that would bring even to the important cultural, to the increase of certain cultural divides. This detachment of the ruling classes from the land doesn't happen everywhere. In certain areas, the most marked by, let's say, the seigneurial character. For example, southern Italy, Spain, Eastern Europe. In these places, the local lords rooted themselves even more strongly at the center of their own agricultural properties, right? And the demographic decrease brought them to actually increase their own prerogatives, and to pressure even more the peasantry that had to pay thus for entirely the weight of the crisis. And you know that especially in these countries that were kind of more feudal in nature, were not less, you see, southern Italy, Spain, were typically feudal areas. Eastern Europe as well, they had been radically refeudalized, especially after the Mongol invasion. So in these areas, the population was also more sparse, and so it was easy for the lords to assert even more strongly agricultural rural lordship, right? In other areas of Europe, if you pick northern Italy or France, certain areas of Germany, etc., England, things went differently. Right, this happened in areas, as we've seen, that had not developed, in fact, a true and proper urban civilization, nor a proto-bourgeois class. Right, so Spain, as you know, was very militarized, were very, very feudal, especially Castile. Southern Italy too was essentially feudal. They had even important cities, but they hadn't thrived independent from a political point of view like the ones of the north. Eastern Europe in general had, very low, very scarce urban density. So it's obvious that things took a direction that also in the modern age would be quite evident in these areas. On the contrary, where both a urban civilization and a proto-bourgeois class had powerfully developed, such as in Tuscany, for example, you still had, however, the worsening of the quality of life of those peasants that were poor and devoid of property, right? As we've seen, Tuscany has the sharecropping. It's something very advanced for times being. It would remain up to the 19th century as an effective land management, let's say, form of land conduction. But this doesn't mean that even in these countries, the peasant, without essentially a true rooting on the land, it was kind of a just there as a monad living on somebody else's land, would benefit from the situation. No. In fact, the direct cultivators of the small land plots, in order to go past the crisis, were obliged to indebt themselves with moneylenders that eventually deprived them of any profit, while the city entrepreneurial class that had bought land assets from the nobility or from ecclesiastical institutions in order to work, was ever more aiming at profit, and therefore ever harsher and demanding towards the peasantry, even more than the old nobility. Wherever anywhere practically, the small property tended, by the mid-14th century, to be swallowed by the great one, right? And the conditions of the dependent peasants worsened, right? And so we can even talk of the creation at this point of a sort of rural proletariat of some way. This had an important, as we will see, it would trigger important consequences, because the peasantry didn't just stop there taking this. At some point they took up arms, and so there are the great revolts of the Jacquerie of the second half of the 14th century in many countries. Actually, the same thing happened in the most urbanized areas with the revolt of the salaried workers working in textile industries and so on. As you know, that thing would be cut down brutally, repressed in blood, and these people would completely lose everything, in the sense that there were good chances for them to gain some representation, even in the world of the time, and instead they lost it completely, because they didn't have really an idea of themselves, or a sense of the fact that this was a generalized problem in general, and so, but just the conditions of the times wouldn't render it possible properly how to put them in communication, how to develop some broader consciousness or whatever. And one of the most important consequences of this all is that, of course, as a consequence of these defeats, the elite, whether it was the feudal one of the patriciate of the cities, increased ever more its own power, kind of brought the peasantry ever more down in the process. And so great part of what we count as the Ancien Regime was created at this point, right, in ways that, as you know, also provided, in fact, in the most advanced countries in Europe, to the conditions for properly the increase of the same productivity and quality of life on the longer run. So it's important to stress that the mid-14th century crisis didn't bring to a refragmentation of Europe. On the contrary, it made it stronger. It made it more compact, right? The mid-14th century crisis favored, not just in this small property kind of land conduction aspects, but properly in the compaction, the rationalization of the great territorial dominations, right? This is the moment, as we were saying, in which, I don't know, in Germany, in Italy, in this very fragmented areas, what you see is that there is not actually further fragmentation, in spite of the general sense of crisis that was striking everywhere in the continent. There is a territorial recompaction, right? There are greater powers that form, and that manage to maintain control, which means that the majority of the people were actually okay, or either they didn't have any other choice, but they were surely not brought to the point of of starving to death, because otherwise they would have definitely taken, the opportunity to rebel, because it was either dying in that way or another. Instead, what happens, and it's quite clear, is that this system was wanted. The majority of people, including the peasantry, etc., saw more convenient at that point, or with no other, with a possibility of survival and of and of safety, in this world tormented by wars, etc., that never stopped, right? This is not just an economical problem triggered by the plague or some other strange thing that happened out of the blue. Probably the worries of these people were not even of sanitary or economical nature, right? They were political, right? And reflected even about today's times. What is the greatest problem that we are here about the pandemic? Is it really about the health, or is it really about the economy even? This is really about politics. It's something else, and it's always the case, by the way. It's not that those things are not important, but they are important because they are bringing to new political, they're triggering some important political and social changes that people are kind of, creating themselves, frankly, right? We have seen also how the plague all triggered a new type of spirituality that was not seen before in the arts, in the letters, and so on. And part of the reason that shows a population that is freaking out, or at least that is seeing kind of a negative outcome of all this, where there is properly nothing more but this sense of impending death and drama and uncertainty and insecurity. And that definitely doesn't speak for the for a great moral strength. Whereas what you see at the elite level is that the elites become ever more secure of their power, ever more actually active and capable, as it hadn't been seen previously, right? Properly in the consolidation of their power. So this is quite interesting because it can tell us also about our own times. And again, it's not necessarily even a bad thing per se. After all, the crisis was already there. It was produced, as we've seen, by factors that couldn't quite be systemically controlled. And so, at some point, it was better to create this new order of stability rather than saying, okay, well, I will just venture out there on my own. Of course, this is not really about today, because today this pandemic is nothing. And in fact, the main problem is this one, that it's impressive how much it could trigger politically, considering the relatively mild nature of the disease and the spread and the amount of death and so on. So think about the time. With the lack of control that we have, with the lack of surplus, with the lack of political centralization, the lack of sanitary means, you have literally 1/3 of the population wiped out. So this triggered a response that could not be probably managed in a different way. As we have seen, the same lower classes at some point rebelled, took up arms, but it was nothing at that point in their view that they could do that they couldn't do before, by the way. Because by the first half of the 14th century, all those victories of infantries against heavy cavalry, etc., mostly produced by the peasants, by the commoners, and so on, were not aimed at really a social revolution of some sort. And while what happens after the mid-century is, first of all, that they start, they're desperate at that point. At that point, it's not even about, again, a real revolution either, because there were probably not the cultural tools or even needs to conceive things like that. They actually wanted to comparticipate power, which is something that at the end of the day is always the deal, right? You don't have to think it just revolution in the totalitarian terms. They wanted to. These people were just trying to stay afloat, right, and while drawing fundamentally, and so they didn't have many other choices. But also failed, as we've seen, in realizing what they could do about it consistently. But it was for their survival, in a sense, or at least for some also recognition of political autonomies that that at that point were being literally, they were sinking literally in the game, in the system. So this aspects are important to stress, and in fact we will be seeing now some other things about the disease, the revolts, and what this brought, generally speaking, about the system. Because really, I think it's really, at least in popular culture, everything is overlooked, of course, but this aspect as well. I mean, how much the mid-14th century changed in depth. Right, it's not much that, again, the system much was changed materially speaking. I've read some studies that challenge even the highest numbers relatively to the losses, to the death of the Black Death. Of course, they were massive, but let's say it's not much them that we should look at or think at. But rather what this triggered in mentality, as always. Right, because unfortunately we've been, deprived, I would say, of any moral and scientific dignity by this prevalence of materialism in universities after the end of World War II. That has completely erased the most important element, which is the moral, the idea. Right, these people changed. We know that they started changing the way they thought. Right, and this is not to say that matter didn't matter, in fact, but it means that that thing probably changed much more than we think actively. Not because it happened, because there was some strange factor that changed things, right? Because that's what materialism brings you to think, in order to give somebody the power to fix magically the thing. No, what happened in this system is that people changed. People deliberately and actively and voluntarily engaged in the creation of the new system, of the new rise of the elites. They needed that. They needed that as protection. They needed them as... This is how it happened after all, also after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, right, the 10th century. The signory, the feudal system, was born consensually. Not to say that, of course, those people were happy to put them to sell out part of their freedom, for protection, and they didn't have any guarantee that would come back, but it was still better than being killed, right? And so again, it was not much about the plague. It was about who had to rule and with which means, and a war was everywhere. So those things are made by humans, are not made by the plague, right? And this is very, very, very important to stress, in my opinion. Because, frankly, and this is just the trivial note, but I'm tired of these videos on YouTube that make the Middle Ages about, look at the gross kind of, creepy thing about, the plague and the bubonic stuff. The plague, the Middle Ages, this dark, weird, unhealthy place where this weird stuff happened. They treat the plague as a joke in terms of, it's just something weird happening and disgusting happening in the past. But the single most important thing is how our own world changed politically and socially. That's the single most important thing. I mean, who cares about the details of the bubonic plague as a general, insight about the period? We know that, right? It's gross. It's impressive, whatever. But then what, right? Then what is that change? Of course, how many people cared ever to learn about these things that are way more interesting, by the way, but they require a bit more of effort, and so that's kind of... It's better to conceive the Middle Ages as the creepy, weird stuff that you look at, clickbait, meme-like thumbnails on YouTube, than, having any kind of, intellectual effort to the level that you could have when you went to school, right? So, that's part of the change we're witnessing today, because also COVID brought us to be incredibly lazier and less considerate and more fatalistic and less responsible than before. This has nothing to do with putting a mask on, right? Which is the least important thing of all. It's about much else, right? And so, but they made you believe it's that, because they could dump you down from any moral and scientific way so that you could become one of those peasants that lost everything back in the day, right? That's exactly the point. But the difference is that at that point, at least, peasants were capable of taking a pitchfork in their hands and going to kill somebody, which was not even done with a great degree of of intelligence or capacity or goodness or justice, right? They wanted just to kill the guy and rob it, and that's the point. As most of any revolution and revolt has ever been about. But at least those people were dramatically much more aware of what their political and violent potential was as individuals, right? Even if they had a very low awareness of the world. I think the average person today, in relative terms, doesn't have a greater awareness of the world. I don't think at all. Like, considering the complexity of the world at the time, yes, a 14th century peasant was much more aware of his own world than a 21st century average person is. Like, even in Western countries about the world today, it's easy. I mean, the sheer degree of unspeakably gross ignorance and illiteracy and underschooling that we're witnesses to today in terms of what we should know in order to engage positively in the world has never happened in history. It's something appalling. Okay, I won't digress in this aspect, but I meet with it every day. It's not a complaint about people that I don't like. It's like I have to explain to people why, I don't know, what's happening, I don't know, with Ukraine and Russia. Like the most elementary thing, but even people who live there that have to ask me why. The most elementary, things about international policy, about NATO, about why don't you know it? Don't you live in the world? Like, don't you have any capacity to read something? Not to be treated like fundamentally like a child, because that's the same level of awareness that I could have when I was 11 about the world I live in. And so that's horrifying, right? We are triggering the greatest political and social changes in history without even realizing what the hell is going on. And this is the scariest thing of all. So keeping this narcissistic culture, it keeps to flatter the radical subpersonalism and moral subjectivism that is literally, that is the creepiest thing I've ever seen. Way more than the bubonic plague, for that matter. It's not even that impressive, frankly, to watch. In any case, for today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.